Hey everybody, welcome back to my dark anthology. Um, Doing something a little different today. Instead of doing fiction, this is a nonfiction. This is autobiographical. Those of you that have, or most of you that subscribed more than 2 years ago, and back when this was a cooking channel. And then all of a sudden, I just kind of dropped off the face of the planet. I did a little content, but then just kind of fell away. This story here kind of explains what's been going on in my life for the last 2 years. It is true. It is personal. I hope it gives you some insight. I hope you enjoy it. I'm not going to say too much about it. I'll just let the story speak for itself. I might say a few things after the story is done. But here you go with my short story, Bis Später.
The display case of pastries stretched before me like a museum of edible art, local fruits nestled in delicate tarts bright against the December gloom outside. I'd passed this case countless times over the past 2 years, my late morning escape between caregiving duties. "Guten Morgen," Helga said, appearing beside me in her crisp uniform, gray hair pulled back in a perfect bun. Behind her, Marie, one of the younger servers, set up for the afternoon, her pink hair and tattoos a stark contrast to Helga's traditionalism. "Das übliche Frühstück, bitte," I said. "The usual breakfast, please." After 2 years, the German came easier, though still not naturally. Through the cafe's windows, Christmas decorations swayed between buildings in the damp winter wind. Here in this quiet corner of Itzehoe, time moved differently, the morning rush long past, leaving the cafe peaceful and half empty. The Frühstück arrived exactly as it always did, the parade of small plates with their carefully arranged meats, cheeses, and lox, the Hackapeter that had become as familiar as any American breakfast. "Noch etwas?" Helga asked. "Anything else?" I shook my head, and she left me to my moment of peace. The fruit salad caught the weak winter light filtering through the windows. Mom had loved fresh fruit, especially in her final summer. I remembered her sitting in her garden, surprisingly strong after months of dialysis, sharing berries with my sister Tina and niece Juliana during their visit. For a moment, we'd all believed she might actually give us another year, or 4. Now, 3 weeks after her death, the house felt too big, too quiet. Uwe and I had fallen into new routines, careful not to disturb the empty spaces Mom left behind. The morning care routines that had structured our days were gone, leaving strange gaps we didn't quite know how to fill. He'd never been one for casual conversation, but now our silent meals together carried the weight of shared loss and uncertain futures. I spread butter on one of the fresh rolls, its crust still crackling slightly. The elderly couple in the corner had left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the soft clink of Marie organizing cups behind the counter. I watched Marie refill the pastry case, remembering Mom's exacting standards about, well, everything. The way dishes had to be loaded in the dishwasher just so, how the laundry needed to be folded precisely, her insistence that vegetables be cut to exactly the right size despite the fact that she never did. I'd bristled at first, this American son unused to such rigid German precision, but somewhere along the way, I learned to do things her way. She had a pride when I mastered another small detail of her carefully ordered world. She'd bragged about my cooking to the other dialysis patients, telling them about the American dishes I'd adapted to German ingredients. "Mein Sohn," she'd say, "my son," her voice carrying that mix of pride and possessiveness I'd come to know so well. She'd describe my latest kitchen experiments to nurses and fellow patients, beaming with pride when they expressed interest in my recipes. At home, she'd corner visitors, insisting they follow my YouTube channel, tears in her eyes as she described my writing, though I'd barely begun to put words on paper. The tea warmed my hands through the delicate cup. Mom had been like that. Difficult one moment, achingly vulnerable the next. She'd demand things be done her way, then surprise me with a moment of pure tenderness, like the day she'd caught me crying after a particularly rough morning of caregiving. Instead of her usual criticism, she'd simply held my hand and said, "Ich weiß, es ist schwer." I know it's hard. "Noch mehr tea?" Helga asked. "More tea?" I nodded, watching steam rise from the fresh cup. Mom had been particular about timing too, not just for dialysis but for everything. The taxi would arrive by 8:30, and she'd fret if we weren't in the garage by 8:10. Like everything else in her world, there was a right way and a wrong way. No in between. I'd learned to appreciate that precision, even if I'd never quite matched it. The last few months had been different though. She'd softened somehow, let go of some of that rigid control. Maybe she'd known time was running out. Or maybe she was just too tired to maintain those exacting standards. Late one evening, after Uwe had fallen asleep in his chair, she'd asked the question that had hung between us for years. Waarom sind wir uns so fremd geworden? Why did we grow so far apart? We'd talked until midnight, about the years of distance, about regrets and misunderstandings. Aber jetzt, she'd said, smiling despite her exhaustion. Warum sind wir uns so fremd geworden? But now I have my two men with me. She'd reached for my hand then, a gesture that bridged decades of separation. The way she'd say it to visitors too, meine beiden Männer. My two men, meaning Uwe and me, always with that same mix of pride and contentment in her voice. Those words had become her mantra in the final months. She'd tell the neighbors, the doctors, anyone who visited, about how her son had come from America to help, how she had both her men taking care of her now. The pride in her voice when she'd introduce me to visitors, mein Sohn aus Amerika, my son from America, as if the distance we'd overcome made the connection more precious. I stirred my tea, remembering how she'd started asking more about the past, trying to understand the gaps in our story. Ich war nicht immer eine gute Mutter, she'd admitted one night. I wasn't always a good mother. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement. We'd both changed in those 2 years. Me learning to accept her need for control, her learning to let go of it, just a little. She'd watch me cook sometimes, in those final months, not to criticize, but just to be near. Bleib noch ein bisschen, she'd say, stay a little longer, when I'd bring her evening hot milk. Small requests that meant so much more than the words themselves. After years of distance, we'd found a way to be close, even if it took illness to bring us there. The morning routine with the taxi had become our ritual. Me helping her into her coat, the careful walk to the garage, both of us watching the street come alive as cars began to drive by on their way to work. She'd comment on the neighbors walking their dogs, on the changing seasons reflected in their gardens. Sometimes she'd tell stories about her own mother, or about my early childhood, stories she'd never shared before, as if she was trying to fill in the missing pieces of our shared history before time ran out. Weißt du noch? She'd begin. Do you remember? And then she'd tell me something about myself I'd forgotten, or never known. It was as if the approaching end had opened some long-sealed door, letting these memories spill out. She'd talk about her own childhood, too, stories of post-war Germany I'd never heard before. The taxi would arrive, and she'd stop mid-story, as if saving the rest for tomorrow's wait in the garage. Even her complaints changed in those final months. Instead of criticizing how I did things, she'd sometimes just watch me work in the kitchen, a small smile on her face. Du kochst wie ich, she'd say. You cook like me, as if just realizing how much of herself she'd passed on, despite the years of distance. She'd started asking me to make my own dishes too, genuinely curious about my cooking, proud when the nurses and other patients praised the chicken soup I'd prepared. The cafe had emptied now, just me and my memories in this quiet corner. Marie was setting up for lunch service. The clink of silverware, a counterpoint to my thoughts. I remembered Mom's last good day, how she'd insisted on sitting in her garden one more time. Meine beiden Männer, she'd said again, looking at Uwe and me, her voice carrying that same pride and contentment even then. The tea in front of me had grown cold, forgotten in the grip of memory. That final Friday morning plays over and over in my mind. The easy conversation about Thanksgiving plans, Mom sitting on her walker in the garage, looking healthier than she had in weeks. Her casual Bis Später as the taxi pulled away. See you later. Spoken with the quiet confidence of someone who expected to come home. Hours later, everything changed. I was getting ready to go grocery shopping when I saw Uwe. His stance was all wrong, scared, and a little angry. His voice shifted from casual German to sharp, urgent tones. I caught fragments of words. Kollabier, collapsed, Krankenhaus, hospital, but his thick regional accent and rapid speech made understanding impossible. The language barrier that Uwe and I usually navigated with gestures and patience now stood like a wall between me and information about my mother. By the time we reached the hospital, she was already on life support. The medical staff spoke quickly, technical German mixing with Uwe's regional dialect, leaving me struggling to piece together what had happened. An allergic reaction during dialysis, a sudden collapse, and now this. Machines breathing for her, monitors beeping in their steady, mechanical rhythm. My mother somewhere beyond reach. The next few days blurred together, marked by the steady rhythm of hospital machines and the weight of mounting bad news. Saturday they took her off sedation, and we waited, hours that felt like years, for any sign of consciousness. The doctors spoke in careful tones, their German medical terminology mixing with gestures meant to bridge our language gap. But no words were needed to understand the growing concern in their faces as Mom remained unresponsive. Sunday brought the CT scan results. Hematoma, they said. One word I did understand. The technical explanations that followed were lost in translation, but the gravity of their tone needed no interpretation. Uwe stood beside me, the distance between our languages feeling wider than ever in this sterile hospital room. Then came Tuesday, and a phone call from my sister Karen that changed everything. She'd spoken with the doctors. Keine Hirnaktivität, they had told her. No brain activity. Karen's voice broke as she translated what I'd already feared. Mom was gone. The machines kept breathing for her, kept her heart beating. But the woman who'd been planning Thanksgiving just days ago, who'd smiled and said Bis Später on Friday morning, would never wake up again. The stark contrast between that last Friday morning and this new reality felt impossible to process. How could someone go from discussing holiday plans to this in just a few days? The garage at home still held echoes of our last conversation, while here in the hospital, monitors beeped in a rhythm that meant nothing anymore. That afternoon, Uwe and I brought the DNR papers to the hospital, documents Mom had signed years ago, making her wishes clear. The doctors spoke with quiet respect as they explained the process, though most of their words were lost to me in a fog of medical German. A pastor arrived, another piece of Mom's final wishes falling into place. In a small but touching gesture that spoke volumes about German healthcare, one of the nurses had arranged electric candles and placed an angel figure in the room, trying to bring some warmth and dignity to the sterile hospital environment. That little bit of humanity in the cold, clinical space meant more than she probably knew. We set up the video call, technology bridging the ocean that separated our fractured family. Karen and Tina's faces appeared on the screen, along with their families. All of us together, yet apart for these final moments. The pastor's gentle prayers filled the room as the medical team began removing the life support equipment. The monitors kept their steady rhythm for a while, then began to slow. We watched, in person and through screens, as Mom's breathing changed, became shallower. The late November darkness pressed against the hospital windows as 6:20 p.m. approached. In that sterile room, the soft glow of those electric candles offering what comfort they could, my mother took her final breath. Tuesday, November 26th, 6:20 p.m. German time. The moment everything changed, marked by the silence that followed when they turned off the monitors. A silence that seemed to echo across the Atlantic, touching all of us, those present and those watching from afar, in its finality. The clink of cups brought me back to the present. The cafe was filling with its lunch crowd, the peaceful morning quiet, giving way to casual chatter and the scrape of chairs. 3 weeks since Mom's passing, and I still found myself drifting into memories at unexpected moments. My tea had gone cold, like so many cups in the past weeks. Time felt strange now, too fast and too slow all at once. The carefully structured days of caregiving had given way to an emptiness that neither Uwe nor I quite knew how to fill. Our shared loss hung between us at mealtimes, made heavier by our limited ability to talk about it. I watched a young mother helping her child with a pastry, remembering how Mom had finally let me take care of her. How those 2 years had transformed our relationship from polite distance to something real and deep, even if it took illness to bring us there. Meine beiden Männer, she'd said so often, and I realized now that maybe that had been her final gift. Not just accepting me back into her life, but making sure I knew I belonged there. My visa would expire in November 2025. The future I'd once planned, a converted hearse, the open American road, felt like someone else's dream now. But what would replace it? Return to Atlanta, where friends waited but life had moved on without me? Stay in Germany, where I'd built something unexpected with Uwe, but would always be the American, the outsider? Or maybe somewhere entirely new, starting fresh with the confidence these 2 years had given me? Uwe and I still shared our evening meals, our limited German and English, creating a kind of sign language all our own. Without Mom as our bridge, we struggled sometimes to communicate, but there was comfort in our shared routines, in the quiet understanding that passed between us. He'd become more than just my mother's life partner. He was family now, in a way that transcended language. The thought of leaving him alone in that big house, with its empty spaces and quiet mornings, weighed on me. But staying meant building a life here, becoming more German than American, letting go of old dreams to embrace new ones I couldn't yet imagine. I paid my bill, gathering my empty gym bag to get my shopping done. Outside, the winter sun played on cobblestones, still wet from morning rain. Mom would have had strong opinions about my future, would have wanted me to stay, to keep being one of her Biden menor. But maybe her real legacy wasn't about staying or going. Maybe it was about understanding that home isn't always where you plan to find it, and family isn't always who you expected them to be. The cobblestones gleamed in the weak winter light, familiar now after 2 years of walking these streets. Somewhere between the early morning taxi rides and the late night conversations, between learning her way of doing things and just adapting my American ways to German expectations, I'd changed. The question wasn't just where I would go next, but who I had become. This person who could navigate between cultures, between languages, between lives. Even if I left, I'd carry this version of home with me. The precision of German mornings, the quiet companionship of shared meals with Uwe, the understanding that sometimes the longest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be, even if it's not where we plan to go.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that. You might have noticed that I did not do the narration, that I used an AI. My intent was to do the narration myself, but as you can probably tell by the sound of my voice right now, I'm very congested and been this way for a few days now, so I decided to use an AI for it. And as a recap of where I've been, I was working on getting a hearse converted and doing a road trip across the entire United States, driving to 49 of the 50 states. Obviously, I can't drive to Hawaii, and doing food content along that trip. That was when this channel was still food oriented. But a few months before I had planned to really get started, my mom fell ill, and as you now know from the story, I've been here taking care of her since then. I don't know what the future holds for me yet. I still have a few more months to kind of figure things out. Whether I stay here in Germany, go back to the United States, or come up with a third option remains to be seen, not just in my personal, but also what's going on politically around the world kind of impacts that as well. I miss her very much, and I am very thankful that I was able to have these last couple of years with her. Miss you, Mom. I hope you all enjoyed this. You take care, and we'll see you here next time. Have a good day.